Welcome to the deep dive. You shared some really fascinating sources about a pretty old puzzle in human history. We're talking about our ancient relatives, the Neanderthals, and how they managed these huge journeys across Europe and Asia. Specifically, we know from genetics and from archaeology, too, that there was this big eastward push sometime between, 120,000 and 60,000 years ago.
That's the window, yeah. And they somehow traveled from places like the Caucasus Mountains all the way over to the Altai Mountains in Siberia.
Which is just huge, over 2,000 miles, right, or 3,250 kilometers.
Exactly. And the real head scratcher for researchers has always been the lack of evidence in between. Finding sites that clearly link those 2 points, Caucasus and Altai,
Mhm.
it's been really tough.
Right, it's like, the start and end points of a massive road trip, but the whole middle part of the map is just blank. Finding that exact route has felt almost impossible. But this new study you shared, the one in PLOS, one by Emily Coco and Radu Ayovita, it tackles this using a completely different method.
Yeah, it's a really clever computational approach. Kind of sidesteps the need for finding archaeological sites every step of the way.
Okay. So, for this deep dive, let's really unpack this. We want to understand this new method, figure out what routes their simulations actually found for this, epic Neanderthal trek.
And what it all means, right, for how they moved,
Yeah,
who they might have run into, and maybe where archaeologists should look next.
definitely. So, let's start with that basic challenge. How do you reconstruct ancient journeys when the physical evidence along the path is so patchy? You mentioned traditional methods often assume the easiest path.
Yeah, the least cost path. It assumes the travelers knew the whole route, knew the destination, and just took the path of least resistance, which, let's be honest, probably isn't how exploration works.
Doesn't sound very realistic for moving into unknown territory, no. You're making decisions based on what's right there, aren't you?
Exactly. You see a hill, you see a river, you decide where to go next. Step by step. You don't have a GPS telling you the optimal route to Siberia.
Okay, so this study uses agent-based least cost path simulations. Let's break that down. What's an agent here? Is it like a little virtual Neanderthal?
Sort of, yeah. Think of them as simulated travelers. Instead of calculating one single best path from A to B, they release these agents, say, in the Caucasus region. And these agents only look at the immediate squares around them on a map. They decide where to step next based purely on local factors like, is it steep? Is there a river blocking the way? Is it freezing cold?
Ah, so they have no clue about the final destination. They're just reacting locally.
Precisely. It mimics dispersal based on immediate environmental cues, which feels, much more plausible for how hunter-gatherers might explore or move through a vast landscape.
Makes sense. And to make this work, they needed really detailed maps of what the world looked like back then.
Oh, absolutely. They built these digital landscapes, really high resolution, like 1 kilometer squares, and they layered in elevation, reconstructed ancient rivers and lakes, potential ice sheets acting as barriers.
And temperature too, right? Because climate must have been a huge factor.
Crucial. They looked at different climate periods using these standard marine isotope stages or MIS stages, basically time slices representing warmer and colder periods.
So they ran the simulations across these different climate snapshots to see when that long journey was even feasible.
And what they found was that successful dispersal, getting agents all the way from the Caucasus to the Altai relatively quickly, was most likely during specific warm periods.
Which ones?
Primarily two windows. Marine isotope stage 5e, that's a major warm interglacial starting around 125,000 years ago, and also marine isotope stage 3, starting around 60,000 years ago.
So MIS3 wasn't as warm as 5e, but still okay for travel.
Right, cooler overall, but it seems to have had windows where movement was much easier than during, say, peak glacial times, when ice sheets would have been massive barriers in the model.
Okay, so we have virtual Neanderthals moving through realistic ancient landscapes during the warmer spells. Now, the big reveal. What did the paths actually look like? Where did they go?
This is where it gets really interesting. What emerged again and again from thousands of simulation runs was a fundamentally northern route.
Northern, not south, around the Caspian Sea or something.
Not primarily in this model, no. The successful paths consistently trended north, up towards the Ural Mountains, and then eastward across southern Siberia.
Wait, through the Urals? Wouldn't mountains like that be a major obstacle?
You'd think so. But the models showed that while, yes, they're a barrier, there are corridors. Specifically, river valleys cutting through or alongside the Urals. The simulated agents heavily use these river valleys, Big ones like the Volga, the Kama, then connecting to the Ob and the Irtysh systems further east. They acted almost like natural highways.
Wow. So the landscape itself, the rivers kind of channeled them eastward along this northern corridor.
It seems that way. It suggests northern Eurasia, maybe surprisingly, has this strong east-west geographic connectivity, especially along those river systems when the climate allows.
And the speed. You mentioned the simulation estimated how long it might take.
Yeah, the model suggested that this whole journey, over 2,000 miles, could potentially be completed in less than 2,000 years.
Less than 2,000 years. That sounds incredibly fast for ancient hunter-gatherers just moving.
It does feel fast.
Hmm.
They base that on modern hunter-gatherer movement rates. Now, Neanderthals might have moved a bit slower, we don't know for sure, but even adjusting for that, it points towards a relatively rapid dispersal.
Maybe. Maybe that speed is why we don't find tons of sites. They were just passing through quickly.
That's definitely one possibility the authors raise. If you're moving relatively fast across the landscape, you might not leave dense archaeological traces everywhere. You're not settling down for centuries in each spot.
Okay, and just to be clear, that southern route, maybe around the Caspian Sea, the model didn't really support that.
Not for this specific scenario. Starting agents in the Caucasus, aiming generally eastward. The simulated successful paths consistently favor the northern trajectory. It doesn't rule out any southern movement ever, but for this large-scale dispersal to the Altai, the northern route seemed dominant in their results.
Got it. And you mentioned rivers and lakes were in the model. Any surprises there? Did water always help?
Actually, no. That was quite interesting. Sometimes, especially during colder phases when sea levels might have changed dramatically, large paleo lakes or expanded seas, like big versions of the Caspian Sea, called transgressions, actually acted as barriers in the model.
Huh. So instead of being a pathway, a big body of water could trap the agents, stopping them moving north or east.
Exactly. It sort of penned them in, preventing dispersal along certain routes at certain times, which is a bit counterintuitive, and it really underlines how important getting those ancient landscape reconstructions right is. There's still work to do there.
Absolutely. Now, the crucial part, how does all this simulation stuff line up with the actual evidence we do have? You know, the bones and tools and genes.
It lines up surprisingly well, actually. The timing for successful routes during MIS-3, starting around 60,000 years ago, that fits almost perfectly with when we know Neanderthals were definitely living in the Altai Mountains.
At sites like Chagorskaya Cave.
Chagorskayo-Klodnikov Cave. Yeah, the dates from those sites are right around 59,000 years ago or so. Bang on with the MIS-3 simulation window.
Okay, that's a strong link. And the earlier window, MIS-5E, around 125,000 years ago.
That one connects beautifully with the genetic story. Genetic studies suggest there was a big Neanderthal population expansion out of Europe, maybe spreading eastward, somewhere around 115,000 to 100,000 years ago.
Which falls right within that MIS-5E warm period identified by the model.
Exactly. So you've got the simulation showing how and when it was possible, and the archaeology and genetics showing that it happened around those times. It makes the northern route scenario during warm periods look very plausible.
And this could also redirect where archaeologists look for new sites, couldn't it? If the model says they could have been in the Urals earlier.
Precisely. The simulation suggests movement through the Urals might have been happening during MIS-5 or even MIS-4, which is earlier than most of the solid Neanderthal evidence we currently have in the Urals themselves.
So maybe there are older sites waiting to be found there, along those potential river valley corridors.
It gives researchers very specific areas and time periods to target for future fieldwork. It's a testable hypothesis generated by the model.
Okay, and thinking about those northern routes, heading east across Siberia, who else was out there?
Well, that's the other really exciting part. Those routes, particularly across the wide open spaces of the Eurasian steppe between the Urals and the Altai, that's prime Denisovan territory.
Right. The Denisovans, those other ancient cousins we know mostly from genetics found in Denisova Cave, which is right there in the Altai.
Exactly. And the timing matches up, too. The model shows Neanderthals potentially moving through these areas during both MIS-5 and MIS-3 periods when Denisovans were likely present in the region.
So what's fascinating here is this model literally maps out potential pathways that put Neanderthals and Denisovans in the same place at the same time.
Yes. It provides a geographic mechanism for the interactions that we know happened because of the genetic evidence. We have proof of multiple interbreeding events.
Like the famous Denisova 11, the girl with the Neanderthal mom and Denisovan dad.
That's the most stunning example, yeah. Dated to around 90,000 years ago, This model shows how her ancestors might have actually met. These northern routes could have led Neanderthals directly into areas where they encountered Denisovans.
Which means finding archaeological evidence in that overlap zone, the steppe, southern Siberia, the foothills, is absolutely crucial.
It really is. The model points to where interactions were geographically likely. Now, archaeology needs to find the traces of what those interactions looked like on the ground. Was it just occasional encounters? Did they exchange technologies? We need sites from that interface zone.
The study also flagged one specific area, didn't it? The Turgai Valley in Kazakhstan.
Yes, the Turgai Valley, or Turgai Trough, is a big geographic depression, kind of a natural north-south corridor. The simulated agents pass through it very frequently on their way east.
And is there any evidence there already?
There is. Surface surveys have found Mysterian stone tools scattered across that area.
Mysterian. That's the Neanderthal toolkit, essentially.
Typically associated with Neanderthals, yes, and other Middle Paleolithic groups. Finding those specific kinds of tools in a valley, the model highlights as a major thoroughfare. Well, it strongly suggests that area is worth a much closer look. More intensive surveys, maybe targeted excavations.
Makes perfect sense. Now, we should also mention the researchers themselves point out this is a model, a simplification.
Of course, no model can capture everything. This one didn't include, say, the precise location of animal herds or usable water sources away from major rivers, or the type of vegetation cover, or maybe crucially, where other groups of hominins might have already been living.
And the landscapes were static snapshots for each period, right? Not changing dynamically within a period.
Correct. So it's a powerful tool, but it's based on certain assumptions and data limitations. Future work can definitely build on it, add more layers of complexity.
But the core strength of this agent-based approach seems really clear.
I think so. Simulating movement based on those local step-by-step decisions just feels more like real-world exploration. And critically, it doesn't just say this area was suitable habitat. It generates actual pathways, specific testable routes that archaeologists can investigate.
So what does this all mean? When you boil it down, it really sounds like geography was destiny, in a way. The shape of the land itself was a huge factor.
It really seems that way. The combination of climate making movement possible and the actual physical landscape, those mountains, those huge river systems acting as conduits, channeled their movements.
Simple rules, local decisions, but leading to these vast, continent-spanning dispersals along predictable corridors.
Pretty much. It suggests that these massive eastward migrations weren't necessarily some grand planned expedition, but maybe an almost inevitable outcome of Neanderthals simply moving into adjacent suitable territory, guided by the landscape, during favorable climate windows.
So this study, using all this computing power to sort of retrace ancient steppes, gives us a really compelling picture. Neanderthals making surprisingly quick journeys across Eurasia, channeled along northern rivers.
Leading them right into Denisovan territory, setting the stage for interactions we see in our DNA today.
It's a fantastic example of how new scientific tools can help us piece together these incredibly ancient stories, even when the direct archaeological trail is faint.
It really bridges the gaps sometimes left by traditional methods.
And it definitely raises a bigger question for you to think about. If basic geography, the lay of the land, could effectively funnel ancient people across continents almost automatically, just based on simple local choices, what other huge patterns in human history might have been shaped, maybe even predetermined, by geography in ways we haven't even considered yet? Something to ponder until our next deep dive.